The helium escape valve has become almost a symbol for watches that were designed to go to extraordinary depths. Some of the deepest dive watches will include a helium escape valve. But what does it do? And why is it on a watch? In order to really understand the helium escape valve, I'll first explain a little bit about diving, because that valve was designed for one very specific part of diving, and it was not designed for typical scuba diving, recreational scuba diving, the sort of thing that you would do between, say, 30 feet and 100 feet of depth. It was designed for commercial diving, things where scientific research is being performed, possibly even underwater documentation, maybe to make a film, to record some kind of event happening underwater, where you have to stay at depth for a very long time. For most divers, a regular dive watch will suffice. There's no need for a helium escape valve, and in fact, most regular dive watches will have enough water resistance built in to handle the typical recreational dive. On a typical recreational dive, the diver will be breathing air. The length of the dive is typically less than an hour. So what that does is that allows our body to handle the molecules that we are breathing in that air, which will start to travel into the tissues of our body while we're diving. When we come back up to the surface, those molecules have to be able to be expelled through the bloodstream and exhaled out of our breath. At depth, everything is crushed into a small size, so those molecules become smaller than at the surface where we're typically breathing air. Those small molecules are able to fit into places they wouldn't normally fit. In nature, everything is always trying to find an equilibrium. So when you have molecules and there's an imbalance between a cell wall, between the amount of molecules on one side and the amount on the other side, they will transfer over if they can fit. So that transfer happens at depth. The molecules expand as we go back up to the surface, and we can end up with issues that are pretty well known, such as the bends. Now, the bends, that is when you have trapped molecules, and it typically is felt in the joints, also in the skin, and it's extremely uncomfortable, and it can also potentially be fatal. So when diving deep enough on a recreational dive, or long enough, there may be the need for 10 minutes of decompression at a depth of about 15 feet. In order to sit there, let our body adjust to the lower pressure at that depth that is not as deep as your dive, in order to let those molecules work their way out of the body and be exhaled. That is pretty much the limit on what we consider recreational diving. We don't want to be diving so deep or so long that we can hurt ourselves. Things get very complex when you try to dive deeper than 100 feet or more than an hour. That's when we have to start breathing things like mixed gases. That's instead of breathing compressed air. There are certain things that can become toxic at certain depths that are mixed in with the air. So using a mixed gas will protect you from those things and also allow you to dive deeper for longer. So typically, when diving deeper for longer, divers will switch to a heliox. It is a mixture of helium and oxygen. So you get the oxygen you need, and the helium is inert. This is where we start to get into the helium escape valve. Even though you are breathing a mixed gas, that does not mean that you do not need decompression. So what we start to get into is something called saturation diving. And saturation simply means that your body has fully saturated with this inert gas, the helium. Saturation means your body will not absorb any more of the helium. So you've reached a maximum saturation of helium. This is why a diver could stay down at a depth of 800 feet breathing this mixed gas, and they could stay there for a whole day. The problem is, they will have to decompress for a number of days in order to fully desaturate, so that when they come back up to the surface, that helium does not expand and cause problems within their body tissue. So a saturation diver will typically stay down longer, because once your body is fully saturated, you've already reached this required decompression time. And that will not lengthen if you've already fully saturated. So the difference between a 1-week dive and a 2-week dive at 800 feet is no different, because you are fully saturated, so you might as well stay down longer. This is when we get into scientific observation taking place under the ocean at a very deep depth, or maybe not a very deep depth, maybe only at 70 feet, but wanting to observe sea life for a week or a month. You'll also find things like underwater welding of pipelines. Any kind of repairs or new structures being built underwater, these will typically be performed by a saturation diver. And the saturation diver will be fully saturated with helium for the length of that dive, and they will be living at depth in a chamber. And that chamber could be on the ocean floor, or it could be suspended above the ocean floor. It really depends what they're working on. So in that chamber, during decompression and desaturation, the pressure will change. There will be less pressure in order to allow your body to slowly get rid of the helium, without the helium expanding to a point where it's trapped within your body. Prior to a helium escape valve, the typical dive watch would actually have helium seeping in through the gaskets. And then, as the chamber rose and decompression took place, the watch crystals were popping off of the watch cases. So that is when the helium escape valve was created, to allow the helium that seeped into the watch case to escape through a one-way valve in order to equalize that pressure between the chamber and the inside of the watch case. So really, unless you are a saturation diver who is going to be spending a long period of time underwater, you really have no need for a helium escape valve. However, the helium escape valve was created as a real solution to a real problem. Now, most helium escape valves are simply a one-way valve that is spring-loaded and will allow pressure built up inside of the watch case to release. It will not allow liquid into the case. These are passive valves. They operate without having to do anything. Simply wearing the watch, saturation diving, going about your day, underwater, in the chamber, they will release that pressure when they need to. On the other hand, there is a manual valve. And the manual valve you'll find on watches like the Omega Seamaster. And it looks like another crown. But that crown needs to be unscrewed during saturation diving in order for that valve to function. For most people, they'll never need to unscrew that valve. Now, the helium escape valve is a little bit more of a statement. It is part of being the most extreme diving tool. It's required for the most technical and dangerous types of commercial diving. But for most people, it's complete overkill. But the science and engineering behind it is amazing. And it has an amazing story, and the history of the development is quite interesting. So out of tradition, it's still on almost all very deep divers. That would be your Rolex Deep Sea and Sea Dweller, Tudor Pelagos. Anything that is the most extreme dive watch from a brand will typically include that helium escape valve in order to set it apart as something that's more than just a recreational dive watch.